Dungeon Master, the CPU was faster, and a helicopter blaster. It's May 1988, and this is Yesterday. History, they say, is written by the winners, but that's not entirely true. History is written by the loudest and/or the most recent winners. This is why people think the NES was universally the most popular 8-bit console, despite its direct competitor still being in production 41 years later. This is why people think the global video game crash was global, affected all video games, and was, in fact, a crash. And this is why people think the 16-bit computer generation was a stroll to victory by what was launched as the Amiga from Commodore in 1985, which is simply not true, even ignoring the fundamental mismanagement that eventually killed it as both a format and a company. For virtually everyone, this is what you think of when you hear Amiga, a wedge-shaped keyboard and computer in a single unit. At the time, badged 500, 600 or 1200, this is the one you probably owned, and it's the style everyone who has attempted, with various levels of trademark fraud, to make a consumer-side Amiga replica has generally knocked off. But the first of those, the 500, didn't appear until 1987, 2 years after the launch of the Amiga. The Amiga from Commodore is what was subsequently retitled the Amiga 1000. The 1000 is, for want of a better description, a PC. A box designed to have a monitor popped on top of it and with an external keyboard and inbuilt PSU. The 1000 is a first-gen product. It had clever touches like a little storage tray for the keyboard under the raised body of the machine, but it shipped with only 256 kilobytes of RAM, a quarter of what would quite quickly become the minimum standard for doing anything useful. Commodore, being Commodore, originally planned it to be half even that, which would have been epically tight when a C128 8-bit machine existed. Although only just. The speed of progress was so great in this era, the C128 launched in the UK 2 days after the Amiga from Commodore had been announced. The point here being, even Commodore still thought normal humans would be buying 8-bit for some time. Hardly surprising when in a world of £100 Spectrums and £200 C64s, the Amiga's planned launch price was £1,700 according to Commodore User. And while the US did indeed get it in the fall of 1985, the UK wasn't supposed to until early 1986.
Then March 1986.
Then May, by which time Commodore had spent £40 million to sell 50,000 of them, a pure marketing cost of about half the retail price of the machine. This led to them losing £25 million in a quarter and closing their UK factory. Any precise details on the launch are tricky because, unsurprisingly at this point, the magazine that would later spend a decade called CU Amiga basically started ignoring the machine in favour of the new £200 C64C. For the UK, the 1000, still just called Amiga, appears to have eventually launched at £1,475, judging by both a retrospective article I found and the next mention in CU, where as early as November the same year they were desperately offering £500 off, which must have delighted the early adopters. But you're now asking a perfectly reasonable question. Why are we the best part of 10% through an ST episode, and I've not mentioned the ST at all? That's rather the point. People don't. The ST ultimately died before the Amiga in the UK. Amiga Format as a magazine outlived its ST sister by 4 years. When we last looked at the ST in the later part of the generation, its games were outsold 6-1 by versions on the Amiga and were generally considered inferior to them. That's not how it began. The Amiga was supposed to arrive in 1985, shuffled out in 1986, costing easily a month's salary, and the version you were actually supposed to buy didn't arrive until June 1987, when the A500 cost £500 plus VAT, or nearly £900 with a monitor and tax. Hilariously, by this point, the retitled Amiga 1000, now with an equal 512 kilobytes of RAM, could be had cheaper. CU themselves point out the list price of an Atari ST was £600. Even this doesn't tell you the whole story, as a helpful Silica ad proves. The STFM is £400, and the M part of that means it'll plug straight into a TV. The Amiga needs a proper monitor. And if you somehow own a compatible floppy drive already, you can pay just $259. Atari themselves were able to sell the STM with a lovely high-resolution mono monitor, the disk drive, and a mouse for less than the RRP of the Amiga 500 on its own. And they were advertising that fact in 3 of the first 9 pages of the A500 launch issue of Commodore User. Commodore may not have noticed due to their reaction being the CEO quitting and then suing them. The Amiga recovered from that shaky start, of course, but for the home user, it's an irrelevancy as a proposition until the 500 dropped to £400 including tax a year later, and started bundling the TV modulator it needed to match any ST launched since late 1985. Really, it barely qualifies as being on the back foot until the famous Batman pack appeared, and that wasn't until October 1989. The ST had 4 years largely to itself. And after much ado, that's where we join them with the launch of ST Action in May 1988, 18 months before the launch of its more famous Amiga-based sibling. We've got the ST's most famous exclusive, and we've got one of the landmark sims it got before either of the machines you'd assume people played it on. Let's explore further. I'm going to tell you now we are not going to do this game any sort of justice within the confines of a 10-minute episode segment. But it'll need to be looked at because reviewed in this issue is one of the ST's crown jewels. ST Action will give it 90%, and in stark contrast to the later reputation of its sister title, this is not a magazine that gives 90s lightly. The next 2 highest scoring games in this issue are an 83 and a 72. Moby Games have it as the best ST game of all time. 5 years from now, with the ST market in an entirely different state, ST Format still had it as their number 4, albeit with the screenshot they appear to have taken with the lens cap on. It's Dungeon Master, and right now it's an ST exclusive. The Amiga didn't get it until the next year, and frankly the ST version still looks better. The PC didn't see it until 1992, after even a SNES version, which is an interesting prospect we absolutely don't have time to look at. So let's just give a flavour of this, and it starts by me reading the manual. A lot. Although surprisingly little of it concerns playing the game. The manual, at around 50 pages, is already only about average for the time, but it spends the first half of that on a mini novel of a story that would these days be rendered in a fancy CGI intro you'd skip.
Isn't progress marvellous?
It's 1987, and you are reminded how early in the mouse and pointer era we are immediately, as the manual feels the need to explain the concept to you like you're 5.
To begin a new game, move the mouse pointer until it points to the word Enter, written on the stone wall or the dungeon entrance. Then press the mouse button to open the doors to the dungeon.
And even that isn't enough, because it feels the need to clarify that means the left mouse button on computers with more than one mouse button. If you've somehow missed it to this point, Dungeon Master is, predictably, a dungeon crawler RPG, and such a concept was not entirely new. It's not even the first to do this in real time rather than turn-based. Dungeons of Daggeroth gets that honour in 1982. This makes Daggeroth a rare win for the Dragon 32, its exclusive UK home. Even so, Daggeroth is of course not a mouse game, nor is it using the screen layout that would basically cover the next decade of RPG, as evidenced by going 5 years into the future and looking at Ultima Underworld. With the best will in the world, I do not feel the average person is going back to Daggeroth. Dungeon Master is when this stuff started looking good. Daggeroth's a technical triumph, but it's still a wireframe. This, in 1987, looks space age. Helped by not having to animate its scenery, it's fully texture matte. It has the sense of place, and especially if you're silly enough to venture beyond level 0 without a torch, it's scary. What is less modern is predictably a lot of how it goes about things. The 20 pages of the manual that are actually manual describe none of the game beyond the intro in any depth, but spend a lot of time talking about ordering your party and how to put items in the right hand so they actually get used. All stuff that's super important to get more than 3 seconds into the game. It doesn't mention that torch, which you'll find in level 0 and is basically essential for getting anywhere, but the game will very happily let you progress without it. Briefly, what it won't let you progress without doing is choosing a party. Despite the story talking about the player as a person, they're not really. You're a ghost, and the first step will be to traverse level 0's Hall of Champions, where previous failures in the dungeon are immortalised. You may resurrect 4 of these characters to be your eyes, ears, and assorted soft squishy bits in the dungeon itself. There are 4 main classes in the game, representing ranges of skills, but having been assured there are no bad choices, I make my decisions based on the ancient wisdom of the first 4 portraits I come across, and proceed through the door. I pause only to collect food, a water skin, and that all-important torch before I venture down the stairs, which appear to have a banister. It's nice this deadly multi-level dungeon obeys health and safety legislation. We're playing a cracked version here because it's 2026 and who is going to play anything else? Which is a good thing because another way Dungeon Master was ahead of its time was brutal copy protection. The disc is formatted differently to the norm, making it slightly higher capacity. But this also allowed them to hide extra data normal utilities would never copy, and even data that would be changed by reading it. If the game read that section twice and got the same answer, it knew it was a dodgy copy. This was a patented technique FTL owned via its parent company Software Heaven, and not something an X-copy could solve. Standard hardware is simply incapable of writing it. The only way to crack it would be modifying the code for the check itself, everywhere it happened. And Dungeon Master did it a lot, including hiding checks inside files people didn't even expect to have code, such as the graphics library. It also doesn't kill you as soon as a check fails. That'd be a dead giveaway where to look. Dungeon Master waits, sometimes considerable time, to start messing with you, and then starts using techniques from subtle to really obvious that it knows. For instance, sometimes it'll crash or fake a memory error, but other times it just starts ignoring some of your mouse clicks, or thrown items just hang in the air, or saves stop working. It took over a year before the first truly cracked copy of the game appeared, a lifetime in software. Doug Bell, author of the system, pointed out it was time well spent, as DM, still an ST exclusive at the time, sold to perhaps as many as half of all ST owners, a stratospheric rate for everything short of a first-party console tentpole game. There is a downside. All this means you can't install the game on a hard drive. Plus, if you have a 1MB ST, the game itself is entirely cached in RAM on first load, which means you know anytime it accesses the disk, it's doing the protection check. Conversely, the PC version has absolutely no protection of any kind, at least in part possibly because PC owners would not accept being unable to install it. You're watching my first attempt to play the game, and despite my worry about the length of time the manual takes to explain the basics of 1987 controls, it's all really quite natural fairly quickly. FTL have thought about these mechanics, and for a very early attempt I'm almost immediately not thinking about it. I can see though why it's not on the mouseless machines, which makes me even more interested in that SNES one. Although there is a fat-fingered moment as Chani inadvertently throws her club straight at the mummy instead of twatting him with it. I feel almost embarrassed putting it back in her hands afterwards. Investigating this area proves fruitful though, the game providing a spell scroll I really should learn how to use at some point, and some useful snacks. There's also a dagger for Boris, briefly. More usefully though, you may have spotted the strange irregularity with the wall. Pressing that opens a secret container with a full-blown sword for the guy, which is going to come in handy. It's a pattern I'm noticing with the game. It's pretty good at throwing in these kinds of things as tutorials. Almost as good at throwing things in as Chani is. So far, we've opened a door, killed a very easy enemy with reverse ichnophobia, and opened the world's most obvious secret. I suspect all these are going to play a big part in what's to follow in less obvious form, with any future blunt objects hidden at least as well as your mum hides hers. The tutorial isn't entirely over. A key is sat on the floor next to a keyhole, which is required to allow you any progress. From here, the relationship of keys to locks will continue without the key literally being left under the mat. Also, someone's stolen the mat. We continue, and knowing I'm not going to be completing the game on this playthrough, I'm not doing anything so clever as keeping a map. Despite the broad sameness of the graphics, I'm not finding myself lost that much. Little touches like moss and hooks providing an anchor to your current location quite well. I've not scratched the surface here, as I didn't expect to. According to the walkthrough I checked, after solving a couple of puzzles and opening a couple of doors, I'm about 1/3 of the way through the first of 13 proper levels. Even so, I can see why people love this. With very few tools, it's drawing me into the world. The puzzles I've encountered have made sense, and I feel with a bit of work on the spells, I have a chance to figure out how to deal with anything, especially as you can save at any point. This continues through the rest of the game, with themed levels and named rooms alongside surprisingly little combat compared to future games of its type. Apparently things get serious somewhere around the worm level, which I do not recommend for an all-inclusive holiday destination. I don't want to spoil further, so if you do want to watch further in the game, might I recommend chum and fellow Big Red Arrow Club member Gears of Games, who has been through both this and Chaos Strikes Back, the game's first expansion, on video. Either the reviews didn't want to spoil either, or they were stuck at about this point. ST Actions is basically a retread of the manual, being half story and half instructions. The only discussion being a last paragraph that basically says, "It's good." ST Action do let their reviewers have their own verdict boxes though. Andy mentions he saw this demoed in stores 12 months before release and celebrates that it's truly next gen rather than a revamped 8-bit game. He's not wrong. It's hard to see this being done effectively on a Spectrum, or more to the point, an Atari 800. He, like me, is a little baffled by the spell mechanic, but absolutely recommends picking it up to annoy a Spectrum owner. That's more than Nick says, with an entirely content-free verdict box he could have written without ever booting up the game. The charitable might suggest this is an illustration of how much this game pushes on the genre, and they feel the need to explain the basics to a readership that will not have seen anything like it before. In this same spirit, we ignore their 3 screenshots that could all have been taken before the first locked door. It's not the interesting review though, because that comes from a magazine not known for their video game coverage, Dragon, one of 2 official magazines for the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons.
And I think you probably don't need me to tell you what the name of the other one was.
They're a mostly black and white magazine, but they devote 3 of their precious colour pages to this game, which they admit to not knowing existed before the end of 1988, with the Amiga version imminent. They still choose to play the ST one though, and while their review also tends towards explaining the basics, perhaps understandable for an audience that might not even have used a computer, their reverence for someone managing to bring D&D to life is clear throughout. They clearly have been addicted by it, as their screenshots come from much, much later in the game, and they've been playing it long enough to be slightly annoyed by the fact the game doesn't support an external drive for the save disk. I suspect they've been save scumming, and frankly I do not blame them. It is though a game in which you cannot entirely lock yourself out of progression. The review conclusion couldn't be clearer.
There's no doubt in our minds that Dungeon Master deserves to be in your software library.
Getting the attention of a magazine like Dragon is a huge win though, and it's a tribute to how far this game was pushing things. As for its legacy, you can probably lean on the fact of how easy it is to play today, and I don't mean just the DOS version. CSB Win, named after the aforementioned expansion, is a plug-and-play download and run version of the game for Windows, based on the original ST release. It starts in milliseconds, and is otherwise an identical experience in every way, except you're not swapping save disks, and it's happily sat in a resizable window, taking fewer resources than your average JPEG. Dungeon Master can still draw you in. I'm going to start again in CSB Win myself. If you're daunted, there are plenty of guides, but either way you should give it a try. Very few games define both a genre and a format, and despite later conversions, this does both. It's a milestone moment in gaming, and Dragon themselves probably called it right in their intro.
If you haven't yet purchased your computer system and plan to run one of the greatest fantasy role-playing games ever produced, we recommend any of the following machines: Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, or Apple IIgs. The reason for these recommendations is that on those computers you can play Dungeon Master.
The other games Dragon choose to cover are something of a mixed bag. Certainly none are Dungeons & Dragons style RPGs. There weren't any. Still though, you'd have thought they could have been slightly more relevant than Exor's Basketball Challenge and Sega's Fantasy Zone.
Maybe they got it confused with Phantasy Star.
In any case, there's another game I think aligns a lot better with the Dragon readership. It certainly does with my own childhood. Gunship from Microprose, also reviewed in this issue of ST Action. My early gaming was Sierra Adventure games. Literally anything with wheels involved I could get my hands on, and Microprose simulations. And if there's one I spent more time on than any other, this was it. But of course, I played it on PC. This is some time before I had an Amiga. But this is a PC in 1987. Dragon feels it relevant to enough readers to use space in their rare and constrained gaming discussion to make it clear that a year after its PC release, Gunship can now be used with the Hercules monochrome graphics card. This was enough of a draw and clearly covered enough of the user base to be worthy of note. Even before that, you were either playing it looking like this in CGA, or, if you were posh, with a full 16 colours in EGA on $2,000 of PC. It took that same 1988 update to add support for faster computers like 286s. It doesn't support any sound cards, because there weren't really any. Actually, this isn't entirely true. The game supported and advertised the Microprose Entertainer sound card, which of all things used the C64 SID chip. It was also never released. It's a useful coincidence though, because despite those limitations, the 1987 PC version was not the original. That would be the C64 a year earlier, with the ST version close behind. Which makes it a strange but useful game for ST Action to have chosen to review in this early 1988 issue. Gives us an opportunity though, because for the time this is a complex piece of simulation software, and while they needed to be on the C64 because that's where the numbers are in 1986, the poor thing visibly struggles, as you can see in this footage from noted internet good lass Sasha. Buy some issues of Between the Scanlines, everyone! The manual also notes there to be some missing features, at least on the tape version. Not surprising for a C64 game that's 300 kilobytes in size already. Notably, the absence of stores and status displays in flight, support for more than one save, and the high score table. Still, this is a heck of an achievement for the time. Even so, an ST version is loading comparatively lightning fast off disk, and having all the features the later PC version would have is a tempting prospect for the flight sim nerd. And there were plenty of those around in the early days, most of whom had the money to spend on a fancy computer. The manual continually warns you about the complexity with a 5-point quick start guide, which gives the timeless advice to avoid Western Europe. It also suggests that before you attempt a real mission, you get lots of practice hours. Their development retrospective on the game towards the back of the manual also points out the game took triple the time and quadruple the people they expected it would. It also has 2 types of manual copy protection, and I know this because having made that joke about cracked versions earlier, the only version I can get working of this isn't. Both of the copy protection methods relate to the real world. To get into the game at all, you will need to identify a piece of military equipment, which, to be fair, is technically knowledge you could already have. There is also a password call and response when you approach friendly bases, the answers to which are included at the bottom of the manual pages.
I wonder which poor bastard had to figure out how to strip that from the newer re-releases.
It does though offer a couple of concessions. There are difficulty levels that primarily change what kind of equipment the enemy will have. You have several combat zones of varying difficulty, of which Western Europe is the hardest. And most importantly, there is an assistance available in the flight model. Helicopters are utter bastards to fly, which is why the death rate of private helicopter pilots tends to be second only to base jumpers. The reason for this is level flight can only be achieved while simultaneously tipping the craft forward to move and changing the angle of the rotors so that doing so doesn't push you into what is technically known as a death spiral. Easy flight removes the second requirement, so that you only use the collective control for height, and the game will handle changing it so level flight occurs naturally. There's also a training camp in the USA where it supplies simple missions, but where the enemies fire blanks. You can stay in this camp as long as you need, which is what the game means by getting hours of practice. Me? I've got 23 minutes of practice, during which I immediately make the mistake of flying in the wrong direction at full speed 5,000 feet in the air, where I'm more obvious than an AI image of Abraham Lincoln playing Doom.
No, I'm not using an AI image generator even in service of that joke. Here's one I drew myself.
Unsurprisingly, this immediately results in a credible simulation of staying indoors on New Year's Eve, and every blank within a 100-mile radius explodes on my tail rotor. But don't you worry about my tail rotor, let me worry about blank. This is of course the point of this tutorial of sorts, and by the end of it I'm very successfully blowing up the minor enemies and even some of the main targets using the cannon. Granted, this is because I've forgotten which of the missiles is air to ground, which ones are guided, or how to aim any of them either way. The chain gun is definitely helping me out a bit too, although on a real Apache this is separately aimable, so I'm guessing it's just assuming a real pilot is doing that rather than making the computer player handle what in real life is 3 separate joysticks at once. And we do succeed of course, albeit by misjudging and nearly landing on the control tower roof. Despite having the word wanker painted in blanks on the side of my helicopter, the game calls this a success, and it's quite literally back home for tea, medals, and the promotion that qualifies me to fly real missions against people with guns who love to shoot Americans.
So presumably it's another mission in America.
Bit of politics.
The second mission goes much the same way, and it's recourse to the manual later that tells me why. I've missed that my plan to fly low and slow means I'm never far enough away from the target when I see them for my Hellfire guided missiles to do much of anything. Apparently the standard tactic to avoid this from professional pilots is to try and appear over the edge of hills and then hide behind them again. I also missed the radar jammer function that could at least stop some of the incoming fire. I want to try these things again, and I see why those hours of practice are suggested. That's not what we do here though, is it? So let's go and see some of those real enemies and see if we've put together anywhere near enough to survive. Organisation is not my middle name. My plan to test the Hellfire guided missiles fails at the point I take off and realise I forgot to pack any. It's the exact opposite of the problem I had last time I flew to Spain. Nonetheless, the game immediately comes into its own. I managed to down a couple of the targets with the unguided missiles by attacking them from further and higher. I even pop up from behind a mountain to get the last target. I haven't even taken a single hit. Job done, and the nearest base is just a few miles south of here, so map on, accelerated time, and let's head home. Oh dear. Yet turns out I'm driving right through their anti-aircraft gun storage facility. And helicopter on fire, I perform an emergency landing. I'm lucky enough they don't spot exactly where though, and inspecting the damage I have one working engine, which I use to perform the heroic military manoeuvre of running away screaming, making it to the edges of the base alive.
I had a great time.
I spent that mission doing everything from sneaking to running at full speed, at heights from 100 feet to a couple of thousand. I approached targets in customised ways to give me the best chance. I was in and out of the map constantly, and I've learned a lot of lessons for future missions. I've even survived. It was 30 minutes and it flew past, although if I wasn't capturing footage I'd have probably chosen to mute it because... Crikey. It's amazing how things come back to you. I didn't play Gunship on an ST in 1986, or even 1988 as ST Action did. It would have been a PC during 1989 or 90. But so much of it is immediately familiar despite rapidly heading for 40 years of clear space. It does tell me that Gunship still has a place. I mentioned before that some of the modern City and God games I've kind of fallen off of because of the sheer complexity of a modern sim. I've tried to play Civilization 6 for instance, and while it's still excellent, there's too much going on. Civ 1 I understand. I could sit down and play an effective game of that right now. Whereas in the months since I last tried 6, I'd have forgotten enough to be starting from scratch. Gunship you can understand. The flying mechanics can be relatively simple, the enemies are easy to understand, the missions logical. There's a progression system that makes sense, and there's always medals to be won. And it rewards experimentation. Plus, in a world where a realistic Gunship-like game would probably suck up hours of your time, Gunship values it. Missions are quick and sensible, to the point the game will actually start internally penalising you if you take more than 20 minutes to do any of them. By today's standards, that might make it a bit thin, but it also means you don't need a 3-week holiday and an advanced degree in aeronautics to understand it. If you have half an hour free, you can make meaningful progress in your career in this serious business sim, and I doubt that's true of many of its modern cousins. These days, the ST one might not be the one to play. It'd be easier to get the GOG source DOS version working, for instance, especially as it comes with Gunship 2000 bundled.
Gunship 2000, of course, was not the version released in the year 2000. That was Gunship, with an exclamation mark. So that's Gunship 2000, a completely distinct game from Gunship, released in 2000, a completely distinct game from Gunship, released in 1986. You might want to write this down.
But back in 1986, it absolutely was the one to play. And as ST Actions say, it was entirely convincing in the way previous Microprose ones hadn't quite managed. The Amiga didn't have this game. DOS didn't have this game. It's amazing the progress. This is an open world, convincing military sim with a very decent amount of depth. This is only 6 years after the most complex flight game in the home was Canyon Bomber. 6 years from Canyon Bomber to this. Animal Crossing New Horizons is that old and Nintendo will still charge you 50 quid for it. So maybe do play it on an ST for the real sense of just how amazing this thing was. And, if you want to play a proper simulation in 20 minutes, still is. History, they say, is written by the winners. The Amiga did ultimately triumph. There is no the ST Mini, although that might just be the modern incarnation of Atari can actually afford lawyers, whereas the many entities claiming to be Commodore now mostly sue each other. I know of no ST magazines in print, whereas there are somehow multiple Amiga ones. If you search for ST User Group online, what comes up is stusers.org, which is a user group for steam turbines.
They seem like nice lads.
There was no Retro Gamer 40th anniversary cover feature for the Atari ST last year, only an Amiga one, even though of course last year wasn't the Amiga's 40th anniversary in the UK. The prevailing story is that the ST was a failure and the Amiga was a triumph. It's just not true. The Amiga didn't even sprint out of the gate so much as ooze, and has obscured the story of the ST ever since. It won the generation, but it did so with a debatably offside goal in the 97th minute having been at least 3-0 down. The absolute clown show of the Falcon and Jaguar, even when compared to Commodore's 32-bit adventures, hides that for the 1980s part of the 16-bit generation, Atari ruled. And as the Amiga caught it in the very early 90s, the consoles were already as close behind as the average BMW driver is behind someone doing the speed limit. And the thing is, at least part of the exclusion of the machine, is that the ST faithful moved on. They went to the PC. They got their games on consoles.
Not the Jaguar, obviously, but other consoles.
Whereas a decent core of Amiga users have spent the last 35 years trying to make Christmas 1989 happen again, and it just won't. It does though colour the conversation when we're still being told this is the year of Amiga on the desktop, to the point of people self-gaslighting 1985 to 95. So what even defines a generational winner? Atari were ahead longer than Commodore were. The Atari skills as a music system meant it was more useful as a productivity tool for longer too. Atari's name still exists squarely in the middle of modern gaming, whereas the only thing anyone who thinks they own Commodore agrees on is that none of them own the Amiga. Whatever your answer, respect the ST. It was there first, And even if you don't buy most of what I've said this entire episode, your Amiga library would have looked a hell of a lot thinner without it. On the back page, This Week in Retro, the YouTube show also available in audio podcast that breaks down everything that's new in everything that's old. It's where you'll find this issue's real mastermind Dave. He, along with Chris and Jason, break down everything happening, including why everything in the 80s was a sunset with a grid, a potential new version of Stunt Car Racer, and why RAM prices are sky high in the 1990s. Oh, and all the truly important anniversaries. Subscribe to them on YouTube or your podcatcher of choice. Join the subreddit to suggest stories, or just message Dave constantly with questions about Dungeon Master and the early history of the Atari ST as I did. Either way, watch their next 4 episodes to bridge the time until the next episode of this show, because it's my favourite month of the year. Later.